Om Shanti. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to another Yoga Small Talk, and we continue with 7 minutes Bhagavad Gita a day. We are reading from chapter 6, the Yoga of Meditation, and we will read verse 20. When the mind, restrained by the practice of yoga, attains to quietude, and when seeing the self by the self, he is satisfied in his own self. So the commentary reminds us, as we discussed in the previous two videos, the verses 20, 21, 22, and 23 must be taken together. So we saw the verses taken as a group, and now we're just going through the text and unpacking the instructions. And we can start from the end. He's satisfied in his own self. So we've read before a similar description of when the mind is our friend and when the mind is our enemy. And when the higher self controls the self, the lower self, when we are able through the higher mind, which is the mind that is discerning, control the lower mind, which is the more emotional, attached mind, then we can rest in the self. Then the self is considered our friend. But when we are under the complete control of the lower mind, our passions, our desires, our attractions to the sense objects, then ideas of renunciation, of discernment, they appear to be our enemies. They appear to be something that disturbs us on our quest for happiness. So here this resonates with the same idea of the higher mind controlling the lower mind. Swami Shivananda tells us how it happens. When the mind is completely withdrawn from the object of the senses, supreme peace reigns within the heart. Beautiful words. So what is restrained by the practice of yoga attains to quietude? It means the mind that has withdrawn from the objects of the senses, and it attains to the supreme peace that reigns within. So quietude here is not the lack of noise. It's actually the existence of supreme bliss. Those attractions to the sense objects, which, like we saw in verse 19, make our mind go with every little wind that it catches. When those are no longer affecting us like that, then we get full of bliss, of joy, of this quietude that is described here. Swami Shivananda continues, when the mind becomes quite steady by constant and protracted practice of concentration. So this principle of constant and protracted practice shows again also in verse 23. We will discuss it there, but also already put a very important mental note on that. The yogi beholds the supreme self by the mind, which is rendered pure and one-pointed, and attains to supreme satisfaction in the self within. So, like Swami Shivananda so beautifully described it in verse 19, the mind becomes the best searchlight, and it shows us the way to knowledge. Here, the mind, which is rendered pure and one-pointed, the mind which no longer follows every little breeze, whether we feel it or not. It's steady, it's pure, it's one-pointed, it's not moving. This mind is the instrument through which the yogi beholds the supreme self. So this is, yogi here is meditator. Meditation is done with the mind. This is why meditation is part of the yoga of action. It is an action of the mind. It's done with the mind. but it also operates on the mind. So as the mind is doing it, the mind itself is changing. So when the mind reaches this state of one-pointedness that is described here, rendered pure and one-pointed, the mind becomes a fit instrument for meditation, in which the yogi beholds the Supreme Self. Again, meditation in the context of the Bhagavad Gita is concentration on God and God alone. In what form? We will discuss in later chapters. For instance, Arjuna asks Lord Krishna, is it better to meditate on God as abstract, the non-dual concept, or to take a form? And Lord Krishna explains to Arjuna which option is appropriate for which person. So how to do it is described later on. But the principle is very clear. Meditation is one-pointed concentration on God. This is meditation in this context, very important to remember. And it's done by the mind, which becomes our best friend, is controlled by the higher self. It's actually merged in the self. In the state of samadhi, the meditator and the object of meditation as if merge. In the lower samadhis, they do not fully merge. It's as if, but the knowledge is gained. So the yogi beholds the Supreme Self by the mind, which is rendered pure and one-pointed, and attains to supreme satisfaction in the self within, nothing else to look for. And the description of this state continues, as we mentioned before, in the next verses, and we will see them in the next study. So please join us. Om Shanti.